Conceptualizing, teaching emotional understanding clients with personality features of autism, Asperger's, and nerds. I call them PFAANs. I'm trying to coin the term, so I'm going to repeat it a lot. And we're going to get into this, but one of the reasons is autism still has a lot of, they really usually mix it with intellectual disability, or the old idea from like the 60s, where you just have kids who will never really function. Kind of deals. So does that make sense? And we'll talk about diagnosis a little, but this is also based on personality. Okay? So conceptualizing it. So would you call autism a disorder or a personality? Disorder. Okay. Here's the catch with disorder, right? Autism makes you really good sometimes at some things, so it can be incredibly helpful in life, right? So, what are we going to kind of look for, right? This is how to think about it. You can see how any personality becomes disordered when what happens? It gets out of balance. That's the fundamental, right? So if you think of any disorder, it's kind of a personality feature. What disorder would you say has no personality feature to it? I mean, it influences your personality, or supposed disorder either influences your personality, or it influences how you perceive the world, or it influences, right? So maybe kind of thinking it a little differently, right? So my three kind of things that I really look for, I adopt this from Freud and Frankl. Three things you ask yourself. Does this stop me from loving? Does this stop me from working? Does this stop me from finding purpose and meaning in my life? If one of those three things is true, then it's a disorder. If it's not, it's just a personality, if that kind of makes sense. So what do we look for? With these types of personality features of autism, Asperger's, and nerds, I take nerds from Temple Grandin. She says, usually if you can call somebody a nerd, you could put them on the spectrum somewhere. How? And we'll get into that a little bit. There's differences in emotional processing and understanding. We'll get into this in much more concrete detail later. Deductive versus inductive thinking of the emotions. How did you guys learn math? Was it 1 + 1 = 2 first? Right? Some of these PFAAN clients, okay, let me then ask you this. How did you learn non-verbal methods of communication? I'm sorry?
I had asked someone the same question yesterday.
Yeah. How else did the rest of us?
Watching others.
Yeah. Experience. So this is the difference between deductive and inductive thinking. Some of these clients, how you learned facial expressions, they learned math. Like they just got math. Okay? So deductive versus inductive. Deductive, I have the whole, I work down to the details. Inductive, I get the details, I work up. How you learned math is inductive. How most people learn nonverbal communication is deductive. For this type of client, emotional learning tends to be inductive. The reason it's so hard to teach, for us sometimes, counselors tend to be pretty good at emotions, right? One of the reasons I think it's so hard, did you ever have a math professor or a teacher who was brilliant at math? How were they as a teacher? They were terrible, right? So you get these things where a lot of these clients, you're brilliant at emotional processing and nonverbal communication, for instance. You got to remember that compared to these clients. And that's why I think there's a lot of hard times dealing with them. Okay? They have trouble just picking up social dynamics. Why? Because nobody taught them like you learned math. Right? It's more natural. It's probably getting worse now because of online and lack of social interactions, period. Also, I really think we've become less formal. I think that's a real problem in social interactions. I think this is true even amongst clients that aren't this way. Talk to the young kids today, they don't even know how to interact. and it doesn't matter what their emotional is, right? Whereas in the old days, you know, think Downton Abbey, right? How many of you have seen that? And you went to a party, someone introduced you to somebody else, right? There was much more social lubrication to meeting others, for instance. And you could trust more in the old days too, because you'd have somebody you knew introduce you, which lent what to them? Now you're online, now you're not having as much social interaction. What happens? So you're even getting, what they call neurotypical kids, showing more and more autism features anyway. So something to watch out for. They almost always have anxiety surrounding social interactions. You'll often see these clients, they won't present with PFAAN, they'll present with social phobia or generalized anxiety or OCD. If you suspect this, you should pretty much test for OCD anyway, probably. Women with these PFAAN features are really good at masking them. So it's almost certainly way underdiagnosed. And it's probably way higher than you'd imagine. And we'll get into that. I'll show you how to maybe assess for that in women. It's much more difficult. What I usually say is men are naturally more autistic than women. And think of how women and men talk about each other emotionally. Men say that women are crazy. And women say that men are dumb. Right? Usually with the emotions. How could you not get that? So you start thinking about it. Asperger always said that autism was an extreme form of male intelligence. And the other thing, and I think this, once you start to recognize the features, and once you've learned to pay attention to these features, you find out that the manifestations of autism, they're not at all rare. And we'll get into what to look for, or just how to kind of tell some of these clients. A formal assessment of autism. So this is the one I use if you really want a formal assessment. This is evidence-based. This is the autism quotient out of England. You can get a free online version. Basically, if you get a 32 or above, there's a series of 50 questions. You suspected autism. I especially use this to support an autism diagnosis because sometimes the DSM, how many of you love the DSM? Good. Good. Absolutely, right? But sometimes it's hard to actually apply what they're talking about, whereas these give us a supporting objective documentation, which is very helpful. You can do that. This is the 50. It's online. You can get it at ASPE test. It'll norm the data for you. It'll give you bell curves, all that stuff. But what's way easier, and it's extra, it's extra believable because it has the University of Cambridge on it, which, as long as it has a good name, who the heck cares, right? You can do this AQ10, which is really easy to administer. Basically, if you get a 6 or higher, and I'll tell you how to score it. And I have some copies if you want them. That supports an autism diagnosis anyway. So that's as formal. I go fast sometimes. You have to stop me, slow me down if you need to, or ask questions. But these are two formal ways of assessing in adults. They don't work so good in kids because they'll go, yeah, I get what people feel. And you're like, have you ever met that teenager who's like, I get what people feel. And you're like, you do not get how people feel, right? So it's a little harder. The other one, I was talking to somebody about, especially diagnosis, about getting services oftentimes, right? The other thing you can do is a structured clinical interview instead of going off the DSM. Like Nussbaum's, it's a little book, it says DSM clinical interview. That's usually will capture a lot easier than trying to do it out of the DSM. Because when it says like tics and stuff, he goes into more questions that you wouldn't think are as related to tics, for instance. Okay, questions, thoughts? This is formal. I thought I'd just give you a formal assessment in adults. It's incredibly hard to find. Informal soft assessments for this. If you want to think about how it looks in women, I suggest this. This is from Samantha Kraft's blog. It's a series of like 150 questions of what to look for in women with PFAAN features or Asperger's features. It's kind of a checklist, everything from naivete, right? A woman who's really naive no matter what happens, that can be an indicator, for instance. So there's a whole series of questions about naivete. not really feeling who they are, often philosophical, much more logical. Also, have they failed, for instance, CBT in the past can be an indicator. Because when you talk about thought stopping and some of this emotional processing stuff that CBT does, that's not naturally accessible to this client without psychoeducation. So you can it gives you a lot. I occasionally use it in men, but it's very helpful, especially in women. It's very long. I usually just give it to them, go home, take it, come back, we'll talk about it. The beauty, too, of this kind of client is usually they like to do research, and they'll tell you if they have the features. So I always throw it out there a little bit and let them run with it and see what they do. This is not similar to personality disorder. You're borderline. No, I'm not borderline. Yes, you are, right? Not that you like to label that, but it's a whole different thing. Because when you find that out, you find out that I'm just not crazy.